actually welcome to the Conference Board's Window on Webcast, Window on the General Data Protection Regulation, which hereafter I'll refer to GDPR, the EU's new data protection regulation. I'm Mary Young. I'm Principal Researcher for Human Capital, and I'm joined here today by a very knowledgeable and multi-regional panel, whom I'll introduce shortly. But first, I want to tell you a little bit about today's webcast. So first of all, I want to review with you what we're going to be talking about today. And so our key questions are these. How big a deal is GDPR for companies? And this is a question that the Conference Board's members have been asking and frankly answering in different ways around the world. Second one is really has to do with employee or with the consent. And we'll hear later from Ben about ways in which consent does and doesn't apply in the employment relationship, but we're interested in what individual data subjects, as they're called, are comfortable with and willing to share or not willing to share, and for what purposes, and to whom. So that's the second big question. And the third big question has to do with the future of data protection, because as we all know, the amount of data is not going to stop, and our concerns about how it can be used are probably going to grow as users become more sophisticated in their use of that data. So this is not an issue that's going to go away with GDPR. So I'd like to now introduce today's panel. And as I mentioned, we've got a really great lineup of people. The first person on your screen is Marion Devine from the UK. She's Senior Researcher for Human Capital. And with me and our colleague Amy Yee has been leading the Conference Board's research on GDPR's implications for human capital data. Greetings, Marion.
Hello, Mary. It's lovely to join everybody today.
Okay, great. And speaking to us from Nielsen is Ben Hayes, who's Nielsen's Chief Privacy Officer. Ben? Okay. And Nilo Paredes, who is UCB, is a pharma company, biopharma company, head of strategy, IT strategy and technology solutions.
Thank you for inviting me. I look forward to it.
Great. And with me in the studio is Susan Getgood, who's president of Getgood Strategic Marketing.
Delighted to be here, Mary.
Glad to have you, Susan. And then finally, we've got a little echo going on here. There we go. This is joining me finally is Lucas Ilves, who is speaking to us from Estonia, I believe, and who's Deputy Director and Senior Fellow of the Lisbon Council, and who has really an insider perspective on the development of the GDPR. So we're really glad to have you all here. And just by way of introduction, everybody who's on this call certainly knows that the GDPR goes into effect this Friday. So we have 48 hours until this goes into effect. And I'm sure you know that this goes farther than any other data protection regulations thus far to ensure the rights of individuals to their own data and to assign responsibility for the processing of that data to those entities, whether they're third parties or companies or governments who are processing that data. And the passage of the GDPR, which obtains to data about EU residents, so it of course affects EU-based companies, but also multinational companies who are dealing with EU resident data. It happens with it really is problematic in certain ways because it hits at the intersection of two very significant trends. And one of these is the explosion of data that's a result of digital transformation, and the fact that this data is a source of economic value. So it becomes both an input to businesses and also a very, very valuable output or byproduct. And so as the saying goes, data is the new oil in the digital economy. So on the one hand, we have the value of data, and on the other hand, we have this growing public awareness and government awareness of the fact that there is potential for great damage to be done to individuals and an erosion of individual trust and public trust about how this data may be used. And nobody needs to be reminded of the most recent object lesson of that, which is Facebook and Cambridge Analytica. So here we have the intersection of these two things, and I think it's a very sort of profound confrontation between two forces. So that's the dilemma we face here, and as I mentioned before, we are interested in the questions about how big a deal is this for companies, what are employees or individuals going to allow for the use of their data, and then finally, what's the future of data protection. And for those of you who are interested in getting credit for today's webcast, you see the information here on the screen about what you need to do in order to secure that credit. So I'm very pleased today to stand in for the Conference Board's chief economist, Bart Van Ark, who normally hosts these panel discussions in the Window On series. And with that, I'd like to move into the actual meat of our discussion today. And to do that, I'd like to begin with a question for the audience. This is our first polling question. And you'll see the question is here. How ready is your company today for GDPR? So you can see four options. By and large, we're prepared. We've still got some work to do, will be the second one. We've started later and we have a lot of catching up to do with a fourth option. So we're really panicking. The sky is falling. So let's take a look here at what your responses are. Okay, so we're seeing that. I'll just give another minute and then we're going to look at the results. May we see the results, please? Just under half of you are saying that by and large your companies are prepared for GDPR. About a third of you are saying that you've still got some work to do. And this is certainly consistent with what we've been seeing in our research at the Conference Board. Not quite a quarter of you are saying that you have a lot of catching up to do, and none of you are saying that you're doing nothing. So I guess that's reassuring, but not surprising especially that still a significant number of companies, I'd say about half, still say they've got some gaps to close or maybe some significant gaps. So with that as a backdrop, let's start hearing from our panelists. And I'd like to start with Ben. Ben, you come from Nielsen, a company whose very lifeblood is data. And so it's tremendously important to your business model. And could you tell us a little bit about what Nielsen has needed to do to get ready for GDPR? And what sorts of changes are you making at Nielsen in order to become compliant?
Sure, thank you. I guess I'd like to just correct one thing, which is that GDPR actually goes into effect at 12:01 a.m. Friday Brussels time, which is in fact 6 o'clock on the East Coast tomorrow. Right. And so we actually have 31 hours, but nobody's counting. Okay, well, so, like all companies, Nielsen has had to review the touch points that we have with personal data across our business and to consider for each of those touch points whether GDPR is implicated, and if so, how it's implicated. Nielsen is, of course, famous for its market research panels and our surveys and online audience measurement products and the like. But we also have employees and marketing contacts and vendor relationships and clients, many of whom are themselves data companies and are quite sophisticated about privacy. And in fact, all companies are data companies at this point to some degree. And so GDPR has implications across many areas of any business. And like all others, we've had to work through the GDPR dimensions for both our services and some of these more mundane things like the CCTV in the lobby of the office. So as you might expect, we have been working through things like updating our privacy notices, creating processes for data subjects to be able to exercise their rights, both their new rights like portability and erasure and their old rights like the right of access. We've been mapping data flows, amending agreements, preparing to meet the new security breach notification requirements. And all of these things are essentially the same. It's the same set of requirements applied to our services. And so while the total volume of things that we might need to consider from a GDPR point of view might be higher because we're a data company, the process of applying the rules is essentially the same process whether we're looking at our products or whether we're looking at our corporate functions.
So it sounds like you're not losing sleep over this.
Well, like I said, there's a high volume.
Yes, and it is your business after all. So, Nilo,
Yes.
how about for you and UCB? So what kinds of personal data are particularly challenging in your industry in terms of GDPR? And can you give us any specific examples of ways in which you'll be processing personal data differently as a result?
Certainly. I think, much like any other company, we have a lot of relationships as well. But fundamental to our company, of course, is the patient. So when we think about that, patient information is critical. Now, what also makes this a pretty interesting challenge is that you start with, at the very beginning with clinical trials, where we're not supposed to know who the patient is, versus commercial, when we're trying to build a relationship with patients. So I think, really understanding the difference requirements of where we stand in terms of developing new medication and new drugs is a tough one. I think from a processing standpoint, and if we come to that a little bit, I think one of the things that certainly is changing dramatically is this notion of consent management, and how does that impact how we're able to use data. I mean, the things as we start thinking about a little bit further down the road with respect to digital therapies, is all driven by data, but doesn't necessarily mean that when you sign up for a clinical trial that you're giving rights to do that. And of course, because in some cases the pharmaceutical industry has gotten a bad rap, we're particularly sensitive to making sure we do what's right for the patient. And this makes it really challenging for us, but I think we have a good process in place in terms of focusing on consent of people's usage of data. And it's probably the biggest change.
Yeah, and that's an interesting twist you mentioned about the difference between building relationships with consumers versus in clinical trials not knowing who people are.
Yeah, and that's it's been a bit mental challenge for a lot of people to understand where does that lie. I mean, in clinical trials, obviously we can't know who they are, but they can't be completely anonymous either, because if there's we learn about some indication that can have some serious side effects, they need to be notified.
Yeah.
That's our ethical responsibility to do that.
So that is an interesting dilemma that you face. Susan, let me go to you next. And so you are in a business where you're helping your clients optimize their social presence, their customer relationships, and use the data that they get from that. And so I'm interested to know whether you see specific industries where GDPR compliance is particularly challenging. And also, in addition, I'm interested in knowing which sorts of data processing are you seeing most impacted?
I think one of the industries that is most impacted has been the digital media or advertising industry, because of its reliance not just on first-party data, which is what we've been talking about, whether it's the data that your customer gives you or you have about your patients, but actually its reliance on third-party data, which is the data that's used to target advertising to you. So the use of combining different data sets in order to then find out who you are and better target advertising is severely impacted, not just because of consent, because I can give consent, but now the requirement to actually be able to manage it when someone withdraws consent.
Yes.
So the technological requirements on this industry and the impact on the business model in the advertising industry has been huge. And right now, I think we see a lot of optics about compliance, but I'm not quite sure how far along a lot of these places are in actual, what they're going to do to comply. I've even seen things like, we're going to shut down our website to European visitors because we can't quite figure it out yet, right?
Yes.
So there's a lot of talk and probably some action. Some people are further ahead than others. And the data that's really impacted is, again, that, I give you permission to use my data as a customer, but I don't necessarily give you permission to then, use it in a different way to then target an ad for me about something else. We've all been stalked by the slipper ad on Facebook, right? You watch those slippers once, and then it follows you all around wherever you go. So I think the advertising industry has a lot of work that it's done and has to do. And tremendous, I think there's going to be innovation there in order to figure out how to manage that consent going forward. But we're not there yet. I think there's a lot of things happening in back rooms. Google is just meeting with everybody tomorrow. I mean, that's literally like last minute, if nothing else. What I think is really the opportunity is for publishers, media, brands, whomever, to build better relationships and figure out how they are, in fact, going to manage that relationship. Once you give me your data, how can I tell you what I'm going to do with it and get that permission and then create a better value exchange? So I'm hopeful that it's going to change the advertising industry for the better. But right now, that's probably of all of the industries that are managing this, probably the furthest behind. I would say that other people on this webcast have been thinking about this a lot longer than a lot of the publishers and media companies have been.
Yeah. So with two things I want to underscore in what you said. One is that notion you said some companies might want to make their websites inaccessible to people in the EU. And one of the things we've heard in our research is there are companies which simply say we're not going to do business in the EU because this is going to be too crippling or it's too unclear, what we must do versus what we must not do. So we'll think about that some more when we get to talking about the future.
See, I think it's next to impossible to know really whether someone is an EU citizen or not. Because remember, it's not about doing business in the EU.
That's right.
It's about whether EU citizens are visiting or working with you.
Yeah.
And, it's not really that easy to know.
Right. Well, that's about the individual.
Yeah.
But we are companies that are just not going to do business at all. Yeah. And the other thing I thought was interesting that you said is you talked about the fact that we're going to see innovations around managing consent. And we'll have a chance to talk later about how innovation could help companies address the data protection issues without having to forego data completely. But let's get on to Marion, because Marion, you've been looking at GDPR's implications for a different kind of data than Susan. Rather than consumer data, you're interested in our research with human capital data, that is data about employees, external talent, including applicants, and also contingent workers. So one of the things I wanted to ask you about, we know that maybe all, B2C companies have many more Cs or consumers than they do Es or employees. So that would suggest that actually consumer data is going to be a bigger problem for those companies. And I wanted to know whether you thought that was true. And also, your perspective as the member of our team in the EU, whether you sense that EU companies are farther along in terms of data protection than those we've spoken to in other regions.
Yeah, thank you, Mary. Well, I think going to your first question, no, it's quite the opposite in that human capital data should be a big concern to all employees, because it's not a case of numbers of employees versus numbers of customers, but it's actually about risk. And there are a couple of things about human capital data is that, number one, it is classified as sensitive personal data, so it incurs the highest level of fine if you get it wrong. And two, because it's sensitive, it also has additional protection under the GDPR. So in that sense, human capital data is something that has to be, as seriously looked at as customer data, and maybe even more so. And just to unpack that, the law has a really extensive definition of sensitive personal data. And I think, as we all know, it's race and ethnicity and TU membership, etc. But it's also now added genetics and some elements of biometrics where they're used for ID purposes. And HR can be processing this data for many reasons, obviously for employment and tax, but also maybe wellness programs, personalized learning and development programs, engagement surveys, diversity inclusion. It's all there, but it's often dispersed across multiple systems, and it can be very hard for HR to really recognize this and track down sensitive personal data. And then on the second point, that it needs more protection. And what this means is that businesses can't rely on the explicit consent of employees to use their data. The GDPR assumes that employees cannot provide genuine consent given the balance of the employee-employer relationship. So that's a big thing. Your employees, You can't just say, well, they consented, it's fine. It's not fine. So if you want to lawfully process human capital data, you have to find additional justification. You do have a choice of conditions, and it's likely that you will rely on the legitimate interest that you have as a business, but you're not allowed to pursue that at the expense of employees' sort of privacy. And that's a judgment then that you're going to have to make. So even if you have their consent, for example, in the use of workplace Fitbits or analysing their social connections at work, will the regulators think that this is okay, or will they think that it's unreasonable and intrusive? So that makes employee data, therefore human capital data, quite complex. In terms of readiness, it's difficult to know. We've certainly seen that there seems to be a very slow motion response. And we've seen research and surveys that do seem to suggest, as our poll did, that about half of the companies won't be compliant by the end of 2018. But our research does suggest that many HR leaders are just simply standing by and waiting for their legal teams to tell them what to do. And I think that maybe EU companies have underestimated the complexity of the GDPR because it brings through certain familiar principles from the former EU directive. So it's more rigorous and far-reaching, and I think American companies are surprised by just how rigorous it is. So I think everybody is sort of scrambling to get their house in order.
Yeah, and I know in our research we've been surprised by the fact that some very illustrious leading multinational companies based in the U.S. are saying, oh, we didn't find out about this very early. So I think that there are companies that are still scrambling as well. So on this whole question, let me go now to Lucas. And you come from Estonia, which is a company which has very rapidly built its digital capabilities and its ability to leverage data in the public sector, in government. So I wanted to ask you about how you see GDPR affecting government and e-government use of personal data. And let's start with that. So go ahead, Lucas. We're not hearing you. I'm sorry, Lucas, we can't hear you. Yes, now we can.
Good, great. So good morning to everyone in the U.S. I'm actually sitting in Brussels right now, and I'm looking at the Council and the Commission, so I can see all the people who are at fault for this. But so the first thing I'd say is that if it's any consolation to everyone, the public sector across Europe is struggling with this at least as much as the private sector is. And in fact, I think if we had to conduct the same poll that we did at the beginning of this session with a bunch of public sector bodies, then the numbers would look worse, and a few of them might say the sky is falling. Estonia, in this sense, is a bit of an exception because we have fairly well-structured, fairly sort of clear data management within the public sector. But I think where most of the public sector is going to struggle is a bit different to the main challenge for the private sector. Some of the consent issues are less difficult because usually we have a lawful basis for processing or we have a legitimate interest. But it will be a lot harder to share data between different parts of the public sector. So those countries that are used to collecting data for one thing and then using that for another application without getting consent again or without having that explicitly specified legally are going to run into trouble. Another difficulty where I think government's going to get tested first relates to the transparency provisions and the right to access their data. I can think of a lot of civil society activists who are going to start trolling governments to ask them for all the data they have available about them. And I think Estonia is one of the few countries that has that. Most governments are really, their data management is not up to where most of the private sector is. Cloud adoption is much lower in the private sector. So I think it's going to be pretty tough for most public sector bodies. The other place that's going to be really problematic is where public and private sector interact. So for instance, in the security sphere, it's quite common for certs, for police to work very closely with large internet companies, with ISPs, to do joint monitoring of web traffic, to do joint takedowns. And even where the public sector itself has a public safety exception that lets them do things like that, it will be much harder for them to coordinate those types of actions with the private sector if it involves sharing personal data, which can include IP addresses.
Oh, that's very interesting. So let me also ask you, Lucas, we know that another part of the GDPR or the EU regulations is that now individual EU member companies can also develop their own data protection law. So it's not as if GDPR is the last word that's going to harmonize everything. How likely do you think that individual member companies, countries rather, are going to add on to the GDPR?
So, exactly. Every country has to pass a law addressing a few provisions. First of all, specifying the legal authority of their data protection supervisor, and then a few other things. And I should start off by saying that most countries have just done this or haven't done it yet. So it's hard to say, and you can be annoyed if you want to with a lot of national parliaments that haven't gotten their act together. They had 2 years to do this. A couple of the places where those differences will come into play first relates to the age of consent for children when it comes to giving informed consent. So the default in the GDPR is 16, but countries can also lower that down to 13 years of age. So in some countries, you'll be able to get informed consent from someone who's 13 years old, and others you won't be able to get it for anyone who is under 16. And then there's some other nuances. So for instance, in some countries, a national ID number is considered personal data or sensitive personal data, and others it's okay to use that fairly publicly. And there are a few other nuances like that. Austria, for instance, considers the data of companies to also be legal persons, to also be personal data.
That's interesting. So I think this is just another dynamic here is that this is not, while the purpose is harmonization, we can't necessarily assume that that's the way it's going to actually play out. So now I'd like to go to a second poll question, which is actually in two parts, and ask our audience to respond. And it's the same question, but first regarding customers and second regarding your own employees. So the first one is, to what extent do you expect your customers will consent to your company using their personal data so long as you explain the purpose? And you can see that there's, think of it as a scale from extremely unwilling or up to extremely willing. And we'll give you a moment more. Okay, so what we're seeing here in terms of the results is that over half of you are saying that your customers would be somewhat willing. A little over a quarter say that they would be extremely willing. So that's quite interesting. And only 15% who with some level of unwillingness. Now it's going to be interesting to compare that to what you think for your employees. So let me ask you that second question. To what extent do you expect your employees would consent to your company using their personal data so long as you explain its purpose? And I'll just add the caveat that Ben mentioned, which is that because of the, or rather Marion, the inequities in the employment relationship, that consent, in fact, is not sufficient as a ground for a company using employee data. But let's, in terms of the will of your employees, how willing or unwilling do you see that they will be? Okay, okay, so now we have our results on this one. And what's fascinating is that we're seeing slightly greater willingness, slightly, or somewhat willing, I guess, is larger, and fewer people who are extremely willing. So I guess we could interpret that as overall a lower level of willingness. Those who are completely adverse to it, not significantly different between the two. But it looks as if you're saying that there will be a kind of a little bit more caution on the part of your employees. And that certainly makes sense given the nature of the employment relationship. It's a much more tenuous thing for the individual whose data is being considered. Okay, so now I'd like to talk a little bit more to our panel. And Ben, again, I'm going to start with you. So what do you think? I mean, you're Chief Privacy Officer. Do you think that the processing of personal data is just inherently, there's no getting around it, legally and ethically fraught for companies? Or is the real issue a lack of transparency? Is that the real stumbling block? What do you think?
Well, first, I don't think that the processing of personal data is inherently fraught. I've been doing privacy for multinational companies for nearly 20 years, and what I've seen in that time is companies working really hard to square their legal compliance with the need to innovate and please their customers. So, but, you know, I do think that the processing of personal data is increasingly complex. And companies make a great effort to achieve transparency, but due to the underlying complexity of how the data is being used, those efforts can and frequently do result in lengthy, technical, legalistic documents that most people cannot understand and for the most part have given up trying to read. And it is, as you allude to, a legal requirement to provide transparency, and I think most companies make a good faith effort to do that. But for a multinational with a variety of products, working across many countries, in many languages, you can imagine the challenge that this presents. But I think even regulators acknowledge that consumers are not in general deprived of information about how their data is used. They're overwhelmed by it. And yet, you know, as the privacy laws change, they come with greater and greater transparency requirements, which generally mean, you know, more and more things packed into a notice. And consumers, for their part, I think, just want to know that they can trust the companies that they share their data with. And they don't want the burden of having to police those data users, those companies either. Which I think leads maybe to where ethics comes into the picture, and law, because law is at some level an expression of agreed upon ethics, but ethics because what privacy means anymore is lawful and ethical data use. And that's what privacy practitioners like myself do. We are technicians of lawful and ethical data use. And when a consumer feels that their privacy is protected, they don't necessarily feel the need to understand all the mechanics and details about what that means. They just want to know that the companies that they interact with are going to do things that benefit them, and they're not going to do things that harm them. So I think the challenge for all companies going forward, because we are all data companies, and GDPR was in part designed to help spur this, is to create an internal culture of responsible data use. And this means privacy education, not only within the business, but also for consumers. It means more privacy by design, more work to demystify these complex processing operations as best we can. I would also just mention that a lot of work's been done in the last few years around ethical use of data, ethics and algorithms, et cetera. Just to cite a couple folks, Jules Polonetsky at the Future of Privacy Forum has been active in this space, Marty Abrams at the Information Accountability Foundation, and Lori Craner at Carnegie Mellon. So I would encourage people who are interested in, you know, in the ethics of data to kind of take a look at some of the literature these folks have been producing, because it's really the cutting edge thinking on this topic.
Yeah, I think those are great sources, Ben, and one of the points you made that I'd like to really underscore is the increasing complexity of both the kinds of data we have access to and the ways we can use it. And given that rapid change, maybe creating that culture in which data is treated ethically and legally, and in which the data subjects inherently trust the data processor is the solution, because who can keep up with? You can't just keep educating your consumers about now we can do this and now we can do that. So Nilo, let me go to you. We know that data can be a significant differentiator or an engine of business growth for companies. It's, you know, data is the new oil. So to what extent do you see GDPR as tying the hands of companies and restricting their ability to capture new opportunities?
So I think Ben hit on a couple of notes that are worth highlighting. One was every company is a data company. I think to the degree that you successfully internalize that, you will be successful or not. Right? So I think that's the first thing. The second thing is he also mentioned trust. And trust is a really tricky thing, because you can't, it takes a lot of effort to earn it, to keep it, but it can be squandered so easily. And fundamentally, those two things are stuff that, you know, you don't usually think about a new business and say, we're going to build trust. But it has to become part of the company's DNA that's dealing with data, that's dealing with, working with on people's behalf. So to answer the question, I don't think it's a question about whether it'll hamper innovation or steer people away. I think the question will become, how do you continue to innovate in a new environment? Now, I think the real trick will come back to, and it's something that also Ben alluded to, is how do you simplify a complex ecosystem so that I can trust this company? Because I don't really want to know everything all the time. And so this is kind of a funny balance. I think it's going to be difficult. The ones that master it really well will be far more successful than the ones that don't. But I don't know that it'll necessarily hamper. I mean, companies will continue to innovate. The question will be is, will they continue to build trust into what they're innovating? And it's, like I said, it's going to be it's a tricky balance. But as long as people are continuing to think about the complex environment in which I work in, and what do I do that's right thing for my customer, my stakeholder, whoever I'm interacting, I think a company can still manage to be very successful. But there's a big difference, obviously, from a Google who's extraordinarily sophisticated with data, and let's say a bus company. But either way, that paradigm, I mean, what's the word I'm looking for? That
Principle?
Yeah, it's going to have to shrink.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yeah, that makes sense. I mean, I think one of the dangers here is that you used Google at one end of the continuum, and I think you said a bus company at the other, and so Google has extraordinary sophistication about its use of data. And does the bus company? I mean, I think there's greater risk exposure in a company that has fewer resources and less developed capabilities of doing the wrong thing. Yeah.
And I think and what's interesting, of course, when everybody talks about auto-driving cars, that's all driven on data, right, to a large extent, where there's machine learning. So, what's I think could be challenging here is that if you think of like the bus company, only you think of yourself, or a truck company is probably more appropriate in this example. If you think of yourself as just a truck company, you might be out of business because that business is going to change.
And I think another factor here is I think trust is binary. People don't think, oh, I trust this company more than I trust that one, but a little bit less. They don't think of it as the continuum, probably. I trust or I don't trust.
Well, it depends on the context.
Okay.
Right? It's sort of like you want to go to a good restaurant, the right person to ask, but you may not ask that same person for a mechanic.
Yes, that's true. Yeah. So, Susan, you have a lot of, I would guess, a lot of clients who may not have EU residents in there. And so I wonder, do you think if the U.S. were, and I think we will be tackling this question of data protection increasingly, I think every country will be, but what about something that's like akin to a credit monitoring service where you can always check in to see who's been looking at your data, was the data correct, et cetera? Would that sort of, not a regulation, but a resource for individuals, would that work?
Just the thought of it sort of gives me the hives, because the complexity of something like that, when you think about all of the different relationships that people have, we've been talking here a lot about, again, first-party data relationships. I'm your customer, therefore I have a relationship with you. That's the case of the bus company. But when you start sort of expanding it out, think about what happens and how we are using this data across, we sell, we rent, we partner, we share, our data moves away from our control and into someone else's control, and then I withdraw consent, and how do I manage? It is a huge problem. I mean, I think innovation is going to come. It's not going to come on in 31 hours. We've got a long way to go before we've actually solved this problem. I actually think the blockchain is going to come in here in some place, because the ability to sort of audit and track is going to be important. What I think is really important in thinking about all of this is, and by the way, if you have visitors to your website, whether you're small and you're a little tiny blogger, or you're a big multinational company, and that person happens to be in the EU, you are actually fundamentally part of this. So everybody is. I mean, there isn't anyone who, unless you, again, figure out a way, and I don't know how the heck you do this, say, I'm not going to let any citizen from the EU ever come to my website. You can't do that. So you have to sort of be thinking about this holistically. And trust is important, but it's also the value we give to our consumers and our customers for the exchange of that data. Are we making better products, better experiences, giving better services, creating better content, when we actually are giving them real value in exchange for that data, then we actually have done what people already on the webcast, Nielsen and UCB are doing, is giving actual value.
Yes.
And I think that's the exchange. And I read somewhere on one of my LinkedIn or Facebook this morning, someone talking about how, thank God Gdpr is Friday and then it'll be over. And I'm like, oh no. I mean, if you think it's over on Friday, you are like sorely mistaken. That's just like day one in a long continuum. And as someone like Ben, who's been involved in the privacy conversation for 20 some years, I am actually thrilled at what's happening with this, because I think it actually is giving consumers much more control over their privacy. And I think that's important, to actually have a good relationship with your customer or your employee or your citizen or whomever it is.
Yeah, and I think this is going to be not only on companies' agenda for the foreseeable forever, but also there are going to be a lot of service providers out there helping their clients figure this out, because they're going to need help. I mean, it's and things will keep changing.
Yes.
So Marion, in terms of, let's just say, employee data or other kinds of human capital data, what are you seeing in research or through your research about best practices about how companies are protecting this kind of data?
Yeah, I mean, I think, Mary, it has to be said that in a sense, HR is the sort of new kid on the block. HR has not had to think about this before, and is really going to have to lean on other specialists like IT and data protection specialists who are already probably in the company. I think that what we've seen is that the most important sort of best practice is really that HR leaders have joined in some sort of enterprise-wide initiative, and it may be led by legal, IT, and data security, but it's really vital that HR positions itself as the steward of human capital data. It knows about this data, it knows where it is, and it knows how it wants to use it. So it's really critical, and I think leading companies with a lead in this area, they realize that HR does have to be a critical stakeholder and has to have an active voice in how the business considers data protection and privacy concerns. And I think I'd like to just pick up on what some of the panelists have said, that I think at the moment HR has not had a chance to really get its head around some of the longer term issues, which is around privacy concerns and understanding what employees think about this, understanding how to build trust and engagement. In the short term, though, we've seen that companies are really opting for a very pragmatic response, which is to take a risk-based approach. So HR is working with enterprise risk management teams to identify, where they really need to protect human capital. And the advantages of this is that companies can show the regulators that they have some sort of roadmap, and also HR is then getting help from the board prioritizing human capital data, and there'll be then sufficient resources investing in helping HR to become compliant. But we are seeing some of our members go beyond that, and they are beginning to think about how they can really embed data protection into the values, the cultures, the DNA of the company. And HR is moving to belong to a permanent governance structure in the top of these companies, and also putting in global process owners, to national or across a function of a multinational company. So just really building in accountability and ownership across the business. And then I think finally in Europe, we're seeing members who have really spoken to us about how essential it is to collaborate with Works Council. And in Germany, I think they have a head start here. And one member that has a headquarter in Germany, now they have for several years, Human Capital Analytics has met regularly with the Works Council to discuss the data processing that they want to do and why. And they've built a relationship of trust and transparency, which is really now serving them very well as they get ready for the GDPR.
Yeah. And it means that they don't have to go through a huge ordeal over each new use of data, that they've built up, a relationship that allows them to operate with trust. So Lucas, one of the, it took many, many years from the first idea to the ultimate execution or passage of GDPR, now its implementation. And so that sort of timeline for developing data protection regulations is seriously out of sync with the rapidity of evolution in terms of technology and uses of data, sources of data, et cetera. So I wanted to ask you how you think regulations can keep up with this much more rapid evolution of what it is that the regulations are trying to govern and protect.
Sure. Well, in theory, the GDPR is supposed to be sort of norms-based. So it's got a bunch of basic principles that should be technology neutral. And we can have an argument on some of the points whether that's really the case. But in terms of what we should expect for the next few years is really a kind of shakedown period as these norms come into practice and data protection supervisors figure out what they actually care about, how they prioritize different parts of data protection, which of the things they're going to find heavily, which of the things they'll go easy on. And there are a couple of things that are probably going to happen in the next couple of years. The first is that we should see some industry codes of conduct get developed that kind of tell companies how they should comply and give you more concrete guidance, and that's going to evolve as the data protection supervisors and the courts weigh in. The other thing I expect we'll see more in the way of cloud service providers saying, look, put your data in our service and we'll make it easy for you to comply with the GDPR so that at least for small companies, they can offload some of that mental and compliance burden. But one of the things that we should be prepared for is that we're going to have 2 rounds of implementation and interpretation. The first one is data protection supervisors figuring out how they want to implement this. The second round is the courts. And ultimately, the European Court of Justice has shown a particularly activist streak on this topic. I mean, some of the famous problems that we've had in data protection, including the right to be forgotten and the difficulties with transatlantic data practice, didn't come from the lawmaker. They came from the European Court of Justice. And one of the things I'd be most worried about in the next couple of years is that at some point the court again might invalidate transatlantic data transfers. And that's something that is frankly impossible to predict.
Yeah.
So during the shakedown period, I mean, the one piece of advice I can give to companies that are not called Google or Facebook is that there are going to be a lot of test cases. You don't necessarily want to be the test case. The currency for courts and data protection supervisors is a complaint, right? They get complaints, that's what they're going to investigate. They don't have the resources or the time to go on fishing expeditions. So this isn't to say you shouldn't be compliant, but be nice to your customers. Don't piss them off. Be nice to your employees. Don't give them reason to sort of go and troll you with a bunch of data protection complaints. That at least means that if the data protection officer comes knocking on, the supervisor comes knocking on your door, they don't have a lot of pressure on the other side to go and find something wrong.
That's a great point.
And the last bit, of course, is it is possible to update this regulation. It's difficult, it's tough, it usually takes quite a few years, but there are some exceptions where when the EU legislators really screwed up and especially done something that hurts small business, we can move in a year and a half. So I think it'll depend a bit on how things play out in the next year or two.
Yeah, we could do 3 more webcasts on this topic. I think there's so much to talk about. And maybe what we should do is plan a year from now to look back and say, what have we learned in this first year about what the regulators care about and how companies are complying. But let's now switch to thinking also about the future with something that you've already started us thinking about, Lucas. And Marion, I'd like to start with you because we do hear from companies some fear that they're simply not going to be able to do human capital analytics, which is increasingly important, not only for HR, but for the business. To what extent do you think companies are going to have to reel back what it is they're just beginning to build?
Well, Mary, this is the really big question that everybody's asking, and that there is doom and gloom, but there's also the opposite opinion that common sense will prevail. I think safe to say it's not going to be business as usual. There is a real danger that the GDPR could limit the use of workforce analytics when it involves European data to just aggregated or anonymous data. And areas that could be hit could be recruitment with all the data scraping that goes on, wellness programs, diversity and inclusion initiatives, and as the panel is saying, it's going to have to play out perhaps sometimes in the court. It could really slow down the use of real-time data that companies want to use to tackle pressing business issues. It's going to be tough, but I think it's imperative that human capital analytics experts really try and find a way through this. And if they don't, there is a risk that maybe in the interim, the C-suite executives might just say, look, let's not do it. Let's just leave out European data when it's identifiable from our workforce analytics. And I don't think anyone wants that not least the regulator.
Right. We are seeing that, though. I mean, we were hearing from companies that's one approach to dealing with. But I think we're also seeing that some of the companies that are the most advanced in terms of human capital data or novel sources of human capital data are sort of pioneering also some of the ways they can continue to do that. But there's going to be a lot of, well, there needs to be a lot of innovation. So
I think as well, Mary, that if companies believe that actually other data protection regimes around the world are going to move in the same direction, and some experts have said that there will be this global ubiquity in data protection laws, if you think that, then it's going to be really worth your while to find a way through the GDPR, because then you could find that actually you've got a significant competitive advantage in the future, and that's got to be a prize worth pursuing.
Yeah. So that's exactly what I wanted to ask you, Susan, which is, do you see that we hear that the GDPR is going to become a kind of gold standard? Do you think that this will become, the companies will simply say, let's adopt that standard globally because it's much easier than doing one,
I can't imagine a multinational company that isn't approaching it from that perspective, because it's actually, or at least over the long term will do so, even if they're not today, because just the cost of having different systems for different countries, and understand digital doesn't have borders really. So if you think about, yes, we can to some degree know that maybe that person is possibly in that country, but you know what, maybe not. It's not that easy. So I think it's far simpler to just approach this from the point of view of, this is a law that impacts a significant portion of the world's population, and let's look at how we can deploy unilaterally across. I also think that, to Marion's point, other jurisdictions are going to follow suit. I find it hard to believe that we won't have some form of privacy legislation in the United States. It may not be good, but we'll have it, and and other countries are going to follow suit. And so looking at it from that perspective, it doesn't make any sense to start trying to create different systems for different countries. It's just craziness. I mean, what is it? I mean, ask the other panelists who actually manage multinational companies. Does it make sense? I don't know. I don't think so.
Yeah. So Nilo, as our technology guy and technology strategy person, what hope do you see for technological solutions in terms of things like blockchain or hashing or encryption, or can they play a role here, or how much of a role?
Yeah, so I guess I'll answer that the short-term view and then the longer-term view. And the short-term view is actually not that sexy in my view, but it's important, and this is around data governance. Now, some companies obviously do this really well, but this is understanding what data sets you have, where do they go, how are they being used. I already mentioned consent and managing that. That's the short to medium-term view of meeting these requirements. I think the longer-term view, and Susan had hinted to it, was blockchain. The blockchain is a really interesting technology in that you own it. Obviously, every transaction is recorded. There are a few things, though, that still need to be worked out, such as the contracts. Writing contracts on blockchain is not always straightforward, and there'll still have to be some work in terms of how that happens. Also, the validation, which is the notion of these things happening on the blockchain, so verification. Right now, it's still very CPU intensive, so that'll come down. But I think with respect to blockchain, it's early days. I think it has a lot of promise. What will be interesting to consider is the whole idea of why Bitcoin, which is based on blockchain, took off is because there was no trust in financial institutions. So then the question becomes, who owns the blockchain? And so some of these questions that still need to come out, because ultimately, if it's, let's say, a General Electric or a Google, an IBM that owns the blockchain, then it's basically I'm giving my trust to them, right? So this is the interesting kind of dilemma that is not fully fleshed out. But I certainly see blockchain as an enabler, certainly for electronic health records, which is obviously the area that's closer to home for me. But in terms of answering the question, in terms of who owns the blockchain, how do you write the contracts, and contracts could bake in consent, right? So it could be, I give, let's pick another pharmaceutical. I give Novartis or Kaiser Permanente access to my genomic data for a year, and at the end of that year, I withdraw, right? That could be written into the contract, and that kind of questions around what data, what consent, and who has access to it still needs to be, and I mentioned this in my earlier point, that complexity needs to be made simpler. So as a base foundation, blockchain is really interesting. I think it still needs to evolve quite a bit more. I mean, and I like to think of it as the internet in like 1996, where you used a character-based browser. You know, if I showed that to a kid today, they'll look at me like I'm weird, you know, some kind of, you know, nerd from the past. So I think that's where blockchain is today. But in the short term, it's really going to be for a lot of companies that are not managing data today really well around the governance. What data sets do I have? Where are they being used? And what consent do I have to use that data? That's a short to medium, not nearly as sexy as blockchain, however.
But it makes sense in terms of short term, longer term. So Ben, let me ask, we've been talking a lot about the challenges, the complexities, the ambiguities about GDPR. So what do you see as the opportunities? What does this present to companies like Nielsen?
Well, I think it's probably too soon to say. As Susan alluded to earlier, the GDPR, or more specifically, the interplay of the GDPR consent requirements with the e-privacy directives consent requirements around the placement of cookies by websites has created a lot of concern and confusion in the industry, and there may yet be some industry-wide ripple effects that I think are still difficult to predict at this point. But I think a lot of questions are asking, or a lot of companies are asking this question and looking to turn GDPR to a competitive advantage. Certainly, there are enough companies out there who would be happy to sell you something that you desperately need for GDPR purposes. Yes. But I think that the most obvious way for it to become a competitive differentiator is for companies who are not able to adapt to it for one reason or another. Preparing for GDPR has not been a trivial exercise for companies that have the expertise and the resources to do so adequately, and many small and medium-sized enterprises do not. So ironically, perhaps, over the longer term, GDPR may give more of an advantage to larger companies that have those resources and that can weather a period of uncertainty or of lost business during that time of change, and smaller players may not be as equipped to do that. But, I would just say from our point of view, GDPR is not a massive sea change. It's a logical extension of the laws that have been in place for the past 20 years. It's essentially a codification of a conservative interpretation of the laws that were on the books. And, consumers increasingly consume what was once TV on online and mobile devices, and we've adapted to those consumption habits by creating, online and mobile measurement. But fortunately for us, we did that following an approach of privacy by design and really kind of embedding privacy principles into our products. So we'll continue to do that going forward, and we feel like that has positioned us well for where we find ourselves today. But, of course, we'll always be thinking about ways to increase competitive advantage, and GDPR is one of those. But fundamentally, I think, again, it comes down to consumer trust. And the competition for consumer trust, and we will continue to work very hard to preserve that, as we have done for a long time. And if we can find ways to competitively differentiate ourselves there, we will.
Great, thank you, Ben. So Lucas, last question. We've heard from Ben about whether or not this creates advantages for some companies and disadvantages for others. Do you see any potential advantages for countries which have less restrictive data protection regulations? Will they be able to capture, business value that other companies in other countries can't?
Well, the short answer is we'll see. I want to push back on or supplement one thing that Benjamin just talked about, which is to say, at the end of the day, the enforcement is going to move at the speed of European SMEs. So it also means that you're not going to have a data protection supervisor in Estonia or in Belgium kill all the local SMEs by an overly strict interpretation. So we should bear that in mind. In terms of whether it provides a competitive advantage for countries with laxer standards, well, the EU has been arguing the opposite, which is that this is a competitive advantage for the EU. I don't really see that, precisely because of the effect we've been talking about, which is that big companies are going to be complying globally. Now, where you could see that come into play is in two ways. The first is that I could see a lot of companies not offering certain services or certain features in the EU. I mean, in the way that Facebook, for instance, for a long time did not offer the ability to use facial recognition to Europeans, whereas they did offer that service in the US. And that, of course, if you that compounds and that accumulates, that also leads to investment decisions, right? You decide where are you going to put a certain division of your company doing certain types of experimentation, where are you going to try out new products and services. There is a narrow category of types of things, well, maybe it's not so narrow, that you really can't do under the GDPR. And the big obvious one is automated decisions based on profiling that have legal effect are required to have a person in the loop in Europe. So you cannot, for instance, have a completely automated parole board system where the robo-judge just hands down his parole decision in Europe ever, according to the GDPR. There has to at some point be a person who's accountable for that decision who kind of makes the final choice. So depending on how that gets interpreted, it might be that certain types of automation aren't possible in Europe, and that could, of course, have an effect. The question then on the aggregate is, how big is the impact of that? Is that kind of an edge case? Is that prohibiting, at the very worst, the sort of dystopian Chinese superstate? Or is that actually getting into the bread and butter of how a lot of companies are trying to save costs and become more efficient with how they automate their services? It's hard to say.
So Lucas, these are questions we're going to come back and check on in the future. But for today, unfortunately, we are out of time. So I quickly want to thank you all for being panelists and thank those of you who are listening. But I also want to flag a couple of upcoming GDPR webcasts that we're doing at the conference board. First of all, we have one coming up on the 20th of June, which will be on what does HR need to understand about GDPR? And that will be followed a week later by another that's looking specifically at what GDPR means for human capital analytics. So those are coming up in June. Second of all, Bart will be back doing the Window On series in June, also on June 20th. And the next topic will be on the retail apocalypse. And please register for that and hear another great panel. And then finally, I will just leave you with this slide, which includes some other resources from the conference board. Thank you to everyone. This has been a really interesting conversation about an issue that is astonishingly complex. Thanks all. Bye-bye.